Welcome everybody to the workshop March 19th, 2024, 5:02-ish. We have 5 members present, 2 running a bit late, so they might show up during the workshop, we'll see. Brings us to item C, hearing of citizens. Do we have anything? We have nothing. And brings us to item D1, receive an update regarding the science textbook adoption beginning with the 24-25 school year.
Good evening, Mr. Horak, Dr. Harkreiter, members of the board. This evening I'll be sharing with you about the process we've used to evaluate and select the new instructional resources for K-12 science, which will go into effect this coming school year. This presentation is informational, and so no action will be requested at this time. However, at the April board meeting, I'll be requesting approval of the purchase of the resources that we're outlining tonight. Before we jump into the selection process, I wanted to frame up the context and some of the constraints that we were working with as we were beginning the process. So over the last year and a half, teams of CSISD teachers have gathered to study the current best practices outlined in the National Research Council's groundbreaking document, the Framework for K-12 Science Education. We also studied research-based instructional routines in science education, and we have carefully examined the changes in our state learning standards, also known as the TEKS. Science is a discipline that is both content and skill. Within that content knowledge is a series of themes that recur regardless of what content you're studying. Our new TEKS are written to more clearly underline the dimensions of content, skills, and themes. All 3 were present in our previous TEKS, but they are way more visible now, both to us as curriculum coordinators and also way more clear to the teachers who are teaching with these standards. The science TEKS are now referred to as 3-dimensional. So those dimensions are the science and engineering practices, the recurring themes and concepts, and the disciplinary core ideas. The science and engineering practices used to just be called the science practices. But now with the name change to science and engineering practices, they have increased the complexity of what students are asked to do while they're learning science. And they also have the purposeful integration of the engineering design process in all K-12 science courses, which I think is pretty exciting. So it's not just an add-on or an enrichment, it's actually written into the standards for all K-12 science courses. In addition, the state added a section to our TEKS that addresses 7 overarching big ideas that are found in all science courses, and those are called the recurring themes and concepts. Another noteworthy change in our TEKS is the clear intention that phenomena would be used to anchor students' learning of science content. A phenomena is just an observable event that can be explained or predicted by science content or knowledge. What you see on this slide is a comparison of the number of mentions of the word phenomena in our old TEKS versus how many mentions are in our new TEKS. So you can see a noticeable increase when you go course by course, and then of course when you look at the span, the numbers get even more dramatic. The last big change I want to mention in our TEKS is the expectation that students would use modeling to represent their thinking and their understanding of science concepts and relationships. Scientists use a wide variety of models. They use physical models, they use simulations, drawings, diagrams, graphs, even mathematical equations. Here you see another comparison, this time for the word modeling between our old TEKS and our new TEKS. The changes here are especially dramatic. You see like it's just a giant increase. It's a little overwhelming when we first looked at this. To illustrate how anchoring phenomena and modeling will look in science classrooms next year, I wanted to share a couple examples. In this elementary unit on non-contact forces, students are shown a phenomena video of a magnetic levitation train. They then draw what they think is happening based on what they know before the unit has even started, and you see that on the left. These initial models that students share give teachers valuable information about what students come into the unit knowing at the beginning. The second work sample on the right, I know it's a little hard to see, but it shows what the same student was able to represent at the end of the unit once all the content, practices, and themes have been experienced. In the second sample, you see magnets, you see gravity labels, you see a ton of force arrows everywhere, labels, and a significantly more writing in their second attempt. This next example is from a high school physics course using the phenomena of trying to pick up a can submerged in water and it not being where you would expect it to be. You see the student's initial representation on the left, a mid-unit revision in the middle, and then a final representation on the right. You can clearly see that a lot of learning occurred over the course of the unit, which allowed the student to write a much more complete explanation of that phenomena. With our new TEKS, student learning across units of instruction is centered around developing scientific explanations for natural phenomena. The ultimate goal of these instructional routines is a shift from learning about to figuring out. Important to mention is also the high value our community and the nation places on critical thinking, collaboration, and problem solving. The shifts in our science TEKS represent a vision where students graduate with a strong foundation in these three areas. Science is an excellent practice ground for these skills to develop. Our strategic design framework and portrait of a learner reflect these same values. Our core beliefs and commitments use words like recognizing diverse perspectives, mutual respect for all, student voice and ownership. The core beliefs and commitments also talk about teachers as facilitators of student-directed, meaningful, real-world learning experiences which phenomena and modeling-based instruction helps accomplish. With all the changes I mentioned, I wanted to share what we're doing in CSISD to make sure we're prepared for all these instructional shifts. Last year, we developed a vision statement for CSISD's science program. Last year, we also evaluated the current state of our science program and developed action steps in 6 major areas of our program based on the results of that evaluation. Those action steps were scheduled out over 3 years to ensure that teachers are supported as much as possible and that the changes are sustained. As of this school year, every campus in our district has 1 inquiry mentor teacher. These excellent teachers have been digging deep to understand these new routines, and with their students this year have been practicing 3D phenomena-based instruction with their students all year long. Next year, these teachers will be a mentoring resource to their campus colleagues who are doing all of this for the first time. The science curriculum writers have worked the last 2 summers and will work again this summer to prepare curriculum documents for our science teachers to use starting next year. And finally, the reason we're here tonight, in order to meet the changes in our TEKS, we developed rubrics that prioritize the most essential features we would need in a new instructional resource. Once those rubrics were developed, we gathered a team of teachers from every science course to help us select the best resources for our science teachers. A variety of rubrics were used in the process. The first rubric we used was a pre-screening rubric. Almost every science course had between 5 and 10 options of resources to choose from, which was daunting. It would have taken our teacher review teams a week to get through that many resources. So to streamline the process, a pre-screening rubric was developed that would weed out any resources that didn't meet our highest priorities. Those priorities were alignment to the TEKS, availability in Spanish for our K-6 dual language programs. We didn't want our dual language folks to have a totally different resource for their Spanish weeks than their English weeks. Also, the resource needed to be built from the ground up for 3-dimensional teaching and learning, and phenomena needed to have multiple touch points over the course of the unit. Most of the resources checked these boxes for the first 3. So in order to separate the pretenders from the contenders, we took a deeper look at whether the resource was designed to be student-driven, which aligns to our district priorities for our strategic framework. Specifically, we looked at how often students were given the opportunity to write their own procedure to answer an investigative question. We looked at whether the resource had built-in sense-making routines, where students could reflect on how their thinking is changing over the course of the unit. It was essential that the resource responded to the TEKS changes that called for more modeling opportunities. Science requires collaboration, so we looked carefully to determine whether student collaboration was essential to student sense-making or if it was just an add-on activity. And last, we looked at the frequency of that argumentation was used in that student collaboration. Once the pre-screening rubric was completed, the 3 or 4 resources with the highest scores were passed on to the teacher committees for their evaluation. Their rubric had some of the same features as the pre-screening rubric, but it also added the visibility of the science and engineering practices and recurring themes and concepts. Our TEKs are 3-dimensional, so teachers should be able to pick up any activity in that resource and see all 3 dimensions without having to try too hard. The rubric also prioritized the frequency of touch points with the anchoring phenomena as students revise their initial model. The minimum would be for students to look at that phenomena at the beginning of the unit and the end. But best practice would be for them to revise and revisit every 3 to 4 days of instruction. We wanted our selected resource to help teachers catch the vision for these new routines. And so it was important for our teacher committees to look at the teacher-facing support materials to make sure they met the high-quality mark. Science is an evidence-based discipline, so our review teams also looked really carefully at when students were given prompts to write to make sure that they were also prompted to give their evidence for that. The teacher committees also considered additional features, although these categories were not weighted as heavily as the previous indicators. They looked at what differentiation was built into the resource. All resources include assessments. It's kind of like expected, but in order to score well in this category, the assessments had to reflect, again, all 3 dimensions of our standards, not just the content. They also looked at technology enhancements such as simulations and gamification. While the teachers were evaluating the resource from their lens, our technology department and our digital learning coordinator were partnering to evaluate the digital side of the resources. We wanted to make sure that the finalists would work with our technology ecosystem, specifically in these 4 areas. The platform, the access, and rostering needs to work well. Logistics of the handshake between our systems and the resources systems, particularly how seamlessly it integrates with Schoology. We wanted to consider how well the resource would support teachers in reaching for higher levels of integration with SAMR. And we wanted to make sure that adaptive technology was built into their digital platform for our students with disabilities. I want to give a quick shout out to Natalie Vila and Kelly Derrick for their help with this. They were really invaluable in this process. When the 2 finalist products for each course were identified, all the science teachers in the district were invited to review the resources and give their feedback, as well as the community. They gave feedback in the following areas: the product's use of phenomena, how well the learning experience is built in complexity over the course of the unit, the visibility of all 3 dimensions of the TEKs, whether or not there was sufficient support for differentiation, the quality of the teacher support materials, and ease of use. So here we have the timeline of this school year's work showing the steps of our selection process that I've kind of talked through, but this gives you a visual of all of it on a calendar. November was a very busy month with rubric development, pre-screening to weed out all the pretenders, and round 1 of the committee reviews, which also included training. At the end of round 1, each course team shared their top 3 products from their initial evaluation. In January, the committees came together again to hear product presentations from the vendors for those top 3. From those presentations, they were able to revise and refine their initial scoring on the rubrics. At the end of the January meeting, each course group eliminated a product so that in February, when it went to stakeholder reviews, the community and our campuses had 2 products to see. In late February, the committee came together one last time to review all feedback and make a final recommendation for their first and second choice products. Before spring break, IMA committee reviewed the initial quotes from vendors and adjustments were made on what we were requesting to fit our available funding. I'm here tonight in March presenting to you all, and we're looking ahead to board approval in April, followed by a lot of professional learning for teachers in the spring and summer, and then August implementation. The resources that our committee requested are as follows. Kindergarten through 8th grade, biology and IPC chose Summit K-12. Their title is Dynamic Science. Chemistry and physics chose Savvis. Environmental systems, astronomy and forensics all chose Cengage products. Chemistry in the community selected an American Chemical Society resource, and A&P chose McGraw-Hill. For each of these selections, we will be requesting 4 years of access to digital platform for teachers and students, 1 year of student consumable workbooks for K-4 only, after which we will assess whether we need to make those purchases in subsequent years. Class sets of hardback textbooks for chemistry, chem-com, and environmental systems, and printed teacher editions for all courses. With any science course also comes lab investigations, which require both the one-time purchase of equipment and the annual purchase of supplies. Our new science TEKs also require engineering projects, which we will need to supply as well. We already have almost all of the equipment required by our new resources, so there'll be limited purchasing that we'll have to do for additional equipment. We're also planning to move equipment from course to course or from building to building, as some content that used to be in chemistry is now in 8th grade, and some things that used to be in 8th grade are now in physics. So we'll be moving some equipment around to help mitigate the cost so we don't have to buy things that we already have. Consumable lab supplies are currently funded through a combination of campus funds and the district consumable closet, both of which are frankly insufficient to support equitable access to lab investigations for all campuses and science courses. Almost every resource we selected has an option to purchase ready-made investigation kits that come prepackaged by activity, but the cost of these kits is astronomical. We believe we can supply the needed consumables, We believe we can supply the needed consumables for dramatically less if we create the kits in-house. The cost for this for year 1 is included in the overall total we will be requesting in April. In subsequent years, we plan to budget for the continued assembly of those ready-made kits for K-8 bio and chem, which will be sent to campuses in early August of each school year. The consumable closet will remain available during the school year for incidentals and quantity adjustments on an as-needed basis. Campus science departments will continue to fund the purchase of perishable items, lab-grade chemicals, and supplies for the courses that didn't request kits. So between now and the April board meeting, I will acquire bids, firm bids from our selected vendors, calculate and prep an order for lab supply kit materials, and calculate and get quotes for any equipment purchases that we need to make. We will submit a purchase request at the April board meeting for board approval. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to present. What questions can I answer?
If I remember correctly, the resource we were looking at were dictated by the state. Like the state gave us a catalog of approved
Correct.
resources. Okay.
Yes.
And then I assume it was during the stakeholder period in February. I remember an email going out that parents had a chance to review. Is that still under the review? Can parents still request to see it?
No, that closed.
Okay.
Any parent that wants to see the materials, I am happy to allow them to see that. There's
But that was that parent feedback's already been factored into
correct.
this. Okay.
Yeah, that was factored in when the committee came back together in February. At the end of February, they reviewed all of the stakeholder reviews from the campuses, which I think we had over 200 reviews from campuses, and then we had a much smaller amount from the community, but that's okay too. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, obviously it's a lot of work that goes into this. When was the last time that the state did science TEKs?
I think it was about 10 years ago.
About 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Tell me you seem fairly positive about the changes in the new TEKs. I know that's not.
I'm really excited
good.
about
That's
them.
not always the case when we
Yeah.
get directed from the state and with our TEKs. So
Yeah.
I was just curious if that's the case. It sounds like there are some real positives
Yes.
happening with the change. And 10 years seems like a reasonable time to make some changes.
Yeah, it was time to dust them off.
Yeah. As far as the cost, obviously it's going to be, there's a lot of things you described, and I'm expecting
Yeah.
some significant cost. This comes from our material
Yes.
allotment, all of it? So it's just,
Yeah, so we're under Proclamation 2024. And so we received funding for instructional materials allotment. So I think the majority of the funding for what we're asking for will come from IMA, and there will be some, I think, supplemented as well from our local funds.
There's not quite enough in IMA to cover the entire expense. It's $200,000 or $300,000 short. So we've got to have some conversations to finalize what the order is going to be and what the other funding source will be.
Yeah, I appreciate the extra step to look at what do we already have, because I'm always suspicious that the publishing companies sell you the textbooks, you have to buy the kit. And looking at, I know that's an extra step, and I really appreciate the deep dive. What do we have that we don't need to buy? Great work on that.
Yeah.
The other thing I was curious about is, like on the slide when you said how much we're going to buy in actual physical textbooks versus kind of online. Can you go back to
Sure, yeah.
that one? Because I'm assuming that has changed over the years and that continues to change. What's
This one.
that? So class sets of hardback textbooks are just for those 3
Yes.
classes.
Those were the only ones that the teachers requested, physical hardback textbooks. So for K-8, they actually don't, and really actually for bio and IPC, Summit doesn't have like a hardback textbook that the students use. What they have is it would keep the teachers from having to go to the copier, basically, is what they would get in a student consumable. So instead of making photocopies, they would tear the pages out of their workbook, and then, all the worksheets would be available for them. So there's pros and cons to that, right? So like, if you buy that and they're not used, then you're still making copies. And if you have physical copies, you can't really modify anything. And so the upper grades, 5th and 5th grade and up, really were like, we want to be able to have the flexibility to modify. We know we're going to use the resource, but maybe there's a question on there that we want to change the wording, or maybe we know that we've got students in our class that are going to need a little extra lift, and so we need to add some additional support. So we'll have the ability with that resource to have editable access of all of the things that we're getting with them as well, so we can have that flexibility. K4 did want for 1 year at least, like they plan to use the resource the way it's written. They plan to tear the things out. And so that's why we're going to do 1 year of that for K4, because they said that that's what they really were interested in. And then we'll evaluate at the end of that year and say, did we really use it? Is it worth it to buy it again or not? And we'll have that conversation next year for all of that. So
All sounds wise. The other question, though, especially since so much of it is digital, how do we accomplish that when we do not have one-to-one devices with students? So how does that actually work in a classroom?
With the additional devices that have been purchased that are going into core content classrooms, I think we'll be able to see, a lot of students being able to interact in that way. The digital platform for students, there's still a lot that happens without a computer. So the teacher will go online, they'll look at the lesson plan, they'll print the things that they need, or they'll pull them out of the consumable workbook. 90% potentially of what's happening is like the students are still going to do the work with pencil and paper, just like I showed you guys on those example models we were looking at, and then turn that in. They're not doing all of that work and submitting it online. So there'll be times that they'll use those computers, certainly, and we'll work on that digital integration with, like I talked about, with the increasing, trying to get up the levels of SAMR. But I don't know that that's going to necessarily be a barrier for implementation.
David, with the 23 bond passing and the devices we've ordered, are we going to be one-to-one in core classrooms 5 through 12? Or 7?
The entire district for 4 classrooms.
Core classrooms, the entire district would have. Yes, ma'am.
And of course, I also the discussion that they're not using that all the time, right? A teacher's still teaching, they're still taking notes, they're still writing things out, right? They're not on a digital device all the time. Thanks for letting me ask all the questions. We haven't had a kind of a TEKS update in a little while, so it's always changing. So thanks, and for all the hard work, too.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Thanks, Amanda. Good
Yep.
job.
That'll bring us to D2, consideration, discussion related to the 24-25 budget development process and property values. Ms. Draws.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Horat, and members of the board, Dr. Harkrider. It's that time of year again where we start to talk about next year's budget, that being that starts September 1, and you'll be asked to approve the budget sometime in August normally. So a lot of the things we're going to talk about today is really related to the current year that we're in, because I consider that the base, so what we're working off of. So we're going to talk about property values and how they affect the budgets. The state of Texas school district budgets. There's a lot of information out in the news right now. Our current year, a little bit of information for 24-25, and then look at our fund balance and next steps. So first, start with a property value timeline. And I'm going to use this current year for an example. So in 2019, when they did a major overhaul of the school funding system, prior to that, we were at what they call a one-year lag in our property values. So we would be using for 23-24 the 22 values for state funding. They changed that to be current year, and everybody thought that's such a great idea. But I'm going to show you why, personally, I don't like it. So we start in May of 2023 with a preliminary report of what our values might be. And then in late July, we get our certified values, and that's what I'm basing our tax rate on and calculating the budget. Then in the fall, we get our tax levy, because there's some changing from the certified to the levy. So we get the tax levy. You as a board are asked to approve that before the bills go out. Then in December, usually while we're on break, Dr. Harkrider can say, I would say, watch for this email and send it to me when you get it. We get what the comptroller calls their pre-release of their property value study. So if you recall, they're going to study our values and see that the appraisal district is in line with where they think we should be. So we have a very, very short window if we see some errors that need to be corrected to turn that in, but it's very short. It's right after we get back from the break. So then at the end of January 2024, we received the comptroller's preliminary values. And that's what we will use for our state funding. Now I've got that highlighted there because we're going to go over that in just a minute. That information is very important. So really, January 31, I just got my values to use in the current year state funding formula, for sure. I've only been estimating up to this point. So February to March is where we are right now. So those districts that did not come within the confidence level that the state comptroller requires, or there are errors, we can submit corrections to that. So that's where we are right now, and we did put in a correction. So for that particular one, we'll look in a minute. So we were not within that confidence level for the comptroller last year. We are this year, but there are some corrections that need to be made. That correction is what will hold us harmless for some of those tax rate reductions that were done last year. So it's very important. Then we have to wait until around August to know if the comptroller accepted the corrections or appeals. Some districts appeal that state value if they didn't come. So we have to wait till August. Then in September, TEA will update our summary of finance and our templates. And then we have 3 years from there to submit any additional corrections that would get us some state funding back. And you see that occasionally as judgments come across for property owners that went that far into their appeals. So again, we were awarded current values, local values on January 31, but we did file a correction in order to be fully held harmless. I have used in all of your estimates you're going to see, I am assuming the comptroller is going to accept the corrections that we filed. So just please know that I did make that assumption. So why is that January 31 date so important in that number? So this is kind of an illustration. So on January 31, when the comptroller comes out with their preliminary report, there's 3 options. We can be within that confidence level, and we are assigned local values. That's the best of the 3. We can be in what's called year 1 or year 2 of grace. That being if we're without that confidence level, we've got some time to correct it. They won't force us into that state value yet. Or if you've exhausted those 2 years, you can be assigned state values. So what happens if you're assigned state values? Normally what happens is the state is higher than your local appraisal districts. So that picture kind of says what happens is you're collecting taxes at a lower value. So your tax collections are in the green. But the higher your values, the lower your state revenues. So that little blank spot of missing funds, that's funds that we would never recoup. So fortunately, we have not gotten into there because we did get state values. We're assuming even with this correction, we will. So that's why that January 31 date and the information we receive is so important. Because remember, we've already adopted the budget too. So now we're just now getting this information. So this is some information from Moat Casey and Associates. So you can see in 2022, when we got our preliminary values, we were in that 69. 69 districts were in year one of grace. That's where we were. And now this year, we're in that 113, where we are within that confidence level. I feel like even with the correction that's sent in, it's going to correct both the local side and the state side, so we should remain within that state value and get local values. So we did move from year one of grace to being in compliance. Now, you've seen this picture several times, but I think it's important to remind everyone. You think when we increase our property values, at least on a per student basis, that we get more revenue, but that's not the case. So when property values on a per student value, meaning property values are growing faster than our enrollment, our property values go up on a per student basis, but our state revenue declines. We really don't gain anything unless the state makes a change in their formula. And additionally, increase in property values requires tax rate compression. So we lower our tax rate with that, but not beyond an established floor. So here's a little history of College Station and our growth. You can see last year, really phenomenal growth. With the $40,000 homestead exemption, we experienced over 17% property value growth across College Station ISD. That's both new properties as well as reappraisals. But then we had that additional homestead exemption from $40,000 to $100,000. So when you take that into account, it's 11.2. But comparing apples to apples, you really have to look at that 17.3% there. So very high growth for College Station ISD. And then looking at our tax rate compression, for the M&O side, we went from 91.5 cents to 80 cents due to that growth. And then they also required an additional 10 cents on top of that, which we didn't quite, I think we were like 9.5 cents because we hit that floor. And then we have 8 cents of enrichment pennies added on to there. So that kind of shows you where our tax rate for 23-24 on the M&O side went because of legislative changes. Right. And then just looking at the history of our tax rate since 1718, you can see the total tax rate went from $1.39.8 to just slightly over 96 cents. So 31% decline over the past 6 years when looking at both of them. That even accounts for the voter-approved tax rate election that we had in 2022 of 3 cents. That's factored into here as well. So now just kind of looking at the state of school district budgets. So I'm going to show you something. This came from Texas ISD. This is information from districts who are probably June 30 year-end districts, not August 31. So they're a couple of months ahead of us in the budget process. But this is what you're seeing statewide. Spring Branch ISD are expecting $34 million in budget cuts. With 144 position reductions. They're replacing all librarians with media center assistants, and they're redesigning their GT programs. Cy-Fair, current year is $73.6 million budget deficit is expected, and $38 million for next year. Round Rock, they're They had growth, but similar to us, their actual enrollment was down from where they budgeted. So they just didn't have the growth that they expected. And that's been considered a high growth district. Current year, they're expecting a $17 million deficit. And they're looking at reductions by increasing class size, reductions in central office, campus level support, decreasing summer school. So they're all across the state. This is what we're seeing. Fort Worth has experienced a decline in enrollment, and they're looking at a potential of 133 FTE reductions, as well as closing a campus. Keller ISD, $28 million deficit, cutting positions. Socorro, $19 million. They had $19 million in 22-23 deficit, and they're expecting $15 million this year. I'm not. So this is what we're hearing across the state. So how did we get here? How did we get into this position? Well, first of all, you've all known since 2019, we have not had any increase in funding on a per student basis. It's been the same. We've had record inflation across the state, and I've listed some of the areas, and I'll show you what ours looks like. We've had increases in unfunded mandates. So mandates keep coming, but there's no additional funds for that. IMA, the instructional materials allotment, you just heard a presentation for. So for 2 years during the pandemic, districts were cut by as much as 50% for the 2-year period. So we still had needed the materials. We had to find alternate funding for that. You've all heard about the ESSER cliff. We've been talking about it since we started getting ESSER funds, but the last of this federal assistance ends this September. So districts, including us, have gotten new positions as well as supplanted the general fund. We were actually encouraged to do so. Preparing for this, trying to build your fund balance for when these funds go away and they come back to the general fund, that you can withstand that for a year or so. Enrollment growth for us has slowed down along with many other districts, but some are seeing that decline in enrollment. So that's affecting it. You get funded on a per student basis and then based on attendance as well. And then there has been a change in our federal funding for SHARS. That's a billing program we have for students that get eligible services within the district. A pretty sharp decline in that we didn't find out about until this fall. So how does all of those things, they relate to us as well as College Station. We are not immune to any of those. So we talked about inflation. So I looked at the 19-20 year because that's the last year we got any increase in funding. And you can see property and casualty insurance went up by 190%. I have been told that at least what they're forecasting for us this next year, we'll not see those we'll have an increase, but not these record increases that we have had. It's kind of slowing and flattening down. Fuel, we've had an increase at 133%. Utilities, 15%. And health insurance, the district side only was 19%. And I focus on these because this totals about almost $4.3 million. And these are areas we don't have much control over. So it's not things that we can cut. We're still going to transport children. We got to keep the lights on and the air conditioning running, property and casualty insurance. So these are things that are kind of out of our control. I didn't even put those other items, but it's almost $4.3 million over 4 years with no funding. Our enrollment, again, we had course took a dip like all districts during COVID. We have picked back up. We are pretty stable from last year to this year, but we are off from where we budgeted. So again, no different from anybody, other districts across the state. And then you can see that our demographer, where in 21-22, after the pandemic, we had a 4% growth. He's estimating less than 1%. For the coming years. So we'll see. Hopefully, we're going to do much better than that, but we'll have to wait and see.
I'd like to point out to review the demographer, it's not that people are necessarily leaving our district, because we're seeing declines, like ILT's losing people to us. It's that people aren't having kids. So it's population.
Both. If you look at the birth rates from 5 years ago, looking at kinder, statewide, those birth rates are lower. But you also see that College Station is a growing community, so people are still moving here. So there's a trend, especially with the talk of vouchers, even with choice. And I think people got some taste of homeschooling during that pandemic. So what we're hearing is the homeschool population has really increased. If you go to some of their conferences, the number of people at those have really grown. So a combination of a lot of things. Esther Cliff, we're going to experience that as well. So in the current year budget, we moved over $500,000 of ESSER expenses back into the general fund. But we still have between ESSER and T-Class and a number of other things that have been helping us out, another $2.4 million that we're going to be either looking to eliminate some of that, find some alternate funding, or come to the general fund. So we're still ironing that out. The other thing is I talked to you about that SHARS revenue reduction. The government came in and changed the formulas for which we're able to bill. They said they'd been incorrect since 2011, which is actually before College Station ISD even participated in the program. But they came back and said they are going to retroactively correct those formulas for all school districts for the past 2 years. And they're going to collect that too this current year with our settlement. So that cost us about $2.6 million that we were not planning on this current year. So to give you an example, we have what we call a settle up. We thought we were going to get a $2.5 million revenue stream at one time, and instead we've been told that we owe $100,000. So that's where that 2.6 comes from. And then they're saying the future revenues will be about a 50% decline. We budget around $3 million a year in SHARS revenues. So for 24-25, we can expect about $1.5 million decline from where I had been budgeting. So you can see we aren't immune to the things that the rest of the districts are experiencing across the state. So you're going to see that in the numbers that I bring back. I'm sorry I don't have much good news today.
Yeah, it's a very depressing picture. I mean, we know it's bad, but yeah, it's really pretty depressing when you put it all together and with some numbers next to it.
So looking at our current year, so this tells you what our budget was and where I think we're going to be. So we budgeted for our appropriations to exceed revenue by about $1.7 million. Okay, then our enrollment didn't materialize the way we thought. I really felt like we could recover from that because interest earnings are up. There's a few other things that's going on. So I was really confident that we could still recover mostly from that and stay within that 1.7, if not less. But we can't recover from the SHARS, $2.6 million revenue hit that we didn't find out about until 1st of November. So we can't recover from that. So right now, my preliminary estimates are hopefully we can stay around a $3.4 million deficit.
Is that the enrollment numbers correct on the S?
Yes.
Wow, okay.
We had a 0.7% decline this year.
I think the number on the left there is the actual enrollment, 14,717, and then the 13,558 is ADA. That's the
Oh,
weighted.
is it? Okay, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Yeah, the weighted would have been
Yeah, I'm sorry,
13,2,
it is.
just about 300 or so. And some of that difference has been made up a little bit more than when we started in August.
Yeah, you're correct. He's correct. Sorry about that. I'll get that fixed. Thank you. So a little bit of positive news. We have added to fund balance last year, so kind of we'll be able to withstand this. We added over $5 million to fund balance last year. So we are total fund balance over $39 million right now. We do have some committed for construction. We may be asking you to uncommit so that we can stay within that number of days that we need to on our spending and keep that financial stability there. But with bond funds and all, I don't think that $5 million is needed. So we do have some fund balance to help us get through this year and next. So for 24-25, our budget goals, we've discussed these in cabinet. Most of these are the same we've had for the last couple of years. We want to recruit and retain high-quality workforce to support instruction. We want to support that instruction in our way of staffing, supplies, equipment, and services, and utilize data to make the best budgetary decisions and recommendations that we can. Rely on data. Maintain a financially healthy fund balance. Plan for that end of ESSER and T-class. And then I list survive because legislative session would start normally in January 2025. So we need to get to that legislative session and see what happens.
So can I ask a question? So do we pull from the fund balance then to make up our deficit
Yes,
budget?
basically.
That's the general practice?
Yeah, there's no other resource, basically. So when you have a deficit, it decreases your fund balance. So how do we generate capacity? That's going to be the big thing that we're looking at. You can increase state funding, but of course that requires legislative action, so out of our control. And we also know that a lot of talk about vouchers. Changes to the property tax structure, but again, requires legislative action and voter approval. Increasing the M&O tax rate, we still have some pennies there that we could increase our M&O tax rate. But again, that's subject to voter approval. And any additional pennies that we would ask for is subject to recapture if we have any to pay. So, and then budget reductions. 85% of our budget is in payroll and benefits. So it would be painful. We can cut in the other 15%, but we're not going to get very far. But we are asking all of our departments and our campuses for some sort of participation in a budget reduction. And when you start getting into that 85%, it will impact instruction, unfortunately. And I circle that one because really of these four, it's the only one that we have control over.
Well, and I just add, I mean, maybe we can look at the 15%, and we always should. I agree.
Absolutely.
But like you said, some of it you listed are things, earlier you listed that we don't have a lot of control over, right?
those are in
Like
the 15%.
Some of those, exactly, some of those biggies, like
Yeah,
the
the health
pool and
insurance.
the insurance and, right.
Health insurance would be in that 85%, but everything else I listed for that inflation for 4 years, that's in the 15. Absolutely. So some of the things, and we have made reductions the last couple of years. Many times you as a board don't see it because what you see is we are reducing budgets in certain areas that's offsetting inflation in somewhere else. And so, you know, where we're not coming for 100% of some of those areas, it's because we found some reductions somewhere else. So I don't want you to think we have not been reducing budgets because we have. We've been looking at how we can save and do things differently. Without negatively impacting instruction, and that has been happening across the district and offsetting inflation. There are many departments that their budgets have not increased over the past 3 and 4 years. So we're finding it somewhere.
Well, that's what I was going to say, Mr. Oz, that not making us reliant on ESSER funds. I've been very impressed with my tenure on the board. You've been using those to get our fund balance back up, using them appropriately. I've seen a lot of districts budgeted off the ESSER funds, assuming it would always be there. And I'd like to note on the payroll, that's without the teachers getting a significant pay increase. It sure as hell not keeping up with inflation. If we're talking about 9% inflation, 2% pay raise, they're taking 7% cut.
None of that.
And as we learned both during the superintendent search and during the TRE, we're not exactly a median pay district. So I think when the viewing public realizes that, it's not that our teachers driving Range Rovers to class.
So again, it's a little bit more information. So we're still waiting on some confirmation. So I talked to you about the hold harmless provision and those values that were so important in us getting our state money to make up for those tax reductions. But currently in the formula, we're not getting 100% of our hold harmless on the debt side. I've been told TEA is aware of this, and they are looking into the intent of the bill and following up on it, but I don't know where it's going. So while we're being held harmless on the M&O side, our debt side, for the part of the tax rate reductions that occurred for those frozen levies is the piece that we're not being held harmless for. So still waiting on that. TEA. TEA and the legislator trying to interpret the bills. So we're looking at, we're waiting to see that information, to see how it affects this year as well as next year. So the debt service rate with the 2023 bond that passed is still anticipated to increase by no more than 2 cents for next year to support that bond. On the M&O tax side, we are accustomed to property value growth and we lower our tax rate. But if you'll recall, I said we are at the floor. So I don't anticipate our M&O tax rate unless they come up with some more changes, mid-year changes. I don't anticipate that tax rate declining by much because we are at the bottom of where we are allowed to be. Revenue, so a minimal increase in state and property tax revenue just due based on that enrollment projection of 0.6% that the demographer gave. That's all I'm using at this point. So that's small of a growth, very little change in total revenue between state and property taxes. And then I've already told you about a $1.5 million decline in our federal revenue, as well as another $500,000 I budget for indirect costs related to ESSER. So no numbers for you yet for 24-25 as we're still kind of working through them and it's early. But just kind of gives you a little bit. So what we are going to do is we're wearing Mr. Dunson out over there. We are focusing on showcasing College Station ISD to attract families. We are a wonderful district. We need to make sure everybody knows that. So he is showcasing CSISD in many ways to make sure people know that we're out there. We want to maximize any alternative funding that we might have. So we have IMA funds, we've got grants, we have ESSER that could go through September. So I'm watching that closely to see if there's any extensions on that and how much that might be able to help us out next year. We're reviewing all resignations before filling. I said we are trying to make data-driven decisions with regard to our budget. We'll focus on class size for our staffing decisions. We've already met with elementary schools looking at that enrollment and trying to hold the line, although of course, you know, we don't want huge classes. That's not good for kids either, but we are monitoring class size to determine a number of teaching staff. And we're asking for, as I mentioned, some budget reductions from all campuses and departments. So everybody is going to participate in some form or fashion, and monitoring our fund balance to make sure that we maintain our long-term financial stability across the district. And last again, survive 24-25, get to that legislative session to see what happens. So with that, I'll entertain any questions.
I was going to say again, great job on the fund balance because that gives a lot of breathing room, takes a lot of stress off of. Sometimes you got to take the hit. Anecdotally, just a quick ratio on the unfunded mandates. How many of those are federally driven and how many of those are state driven?
I don't have
Okay.
that information.
Most of those would be state-driven. Yeah.
What is kind of our fund balance drop dead number?
They want, I think it's 70 days of operating expenditures. So I had that calculated on the last one. We made it, there's two things. They look at that and then they look at how much a percentage that your fund balance can change. So it would be probably in the mid 20 millions. I'm going to guess between 20 and 30 million would be that number. You also have to remember that I've tracked this before. I think some board members were interested in it in the fall because we do not start getting any revenue of any amount until like December. So September, October, and November, we use about $15 million of our fund balance to get us to that point for cash flow. That's where many districts have to borrow funds, and we do not have to do that.
And just a reminder where we are on them, it's, right, you said it was 39 now? And then how much, what will it be at like the end of
I think it's going to
August?
be around $3.5 million come out of it for this year.
Or
is
just
what
for
my
this
projection-
current year? So it is going to be significantly less at the end of this year. Say again?
It puts it over the recent decade.
Yeah. But it's a percentage of our budget though, too, right? As our budget
Yeah.
is, I mean,
So,
it's
I
not
mean, for
increasing
this-
much right now, but it has over the decade.
For
right?
this end of this fiscal year, I think the fund balance will be fine with all the calculations. It's 24, 25 that's the concern. Because we haven't even factored any increases, salary increases, health insurance, anything like that yet.
My only other comment is I wish more people could see the front end of this presentation and really just understand how much of the situation that we, as really a state, are in, as far as funding for public education, is out of our control, right? And how bad it is, those two things. A lot of it comes from our state government, and then some of it is the other factors like inflation. But it's bad. It's a bad picture. But thanks for putting it together in a very clear and measurable way on how it's impacting us.
I think the big piece is that we as a district, Amy leading charge on this, and in the past, we've been a fiscally responsible district. And you have managed the ESSER funds to a T, where I hear of other districts that are about to be in a world of hurt because, I mean, they looked at that as gravy and things like that. And so,
Well, we have a lot to move over.
Yeah.
We did have some added positions that were much needed,
Right.
counselors and those sorts, and we used it to supplant. But we did not add, I would say as a district, we did not add a tremendous amount of expenditures.
so, and based on our performance as a district and things like that, comparatively speaking to districts that surround us, we don't get a lot of the federal grants, federal funds, and ESSER funds that some of these other districts were able to get, which is fine. We'll deal with that, and we have. But I think that's a positive that we do have going into this situation. And, we all got through COVID, and we're going to figure this out. That's just the way it is. It's life, and we just have to deal with it and strategically plan accordingly. So I appreciate the first report on this. It's not doom and gloom in my eyes, but I'd rather have the negative on the front end and hopefully see some positive on the back. So we'll see where we're at. Anything else?
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I mean, we sit here with long faces because we're facing these challenges, but I appreciate that you mentioned that, Austin's working really hard to showcase our students in CSISD because we still have all the positives there. And, that's why we're sitting here making the finances work and why you work really hard at your job too, is so that our students can have those successes. So I appreciate that part of your presentation too. And just, that's a good reminder to all of us why we're doing this. Can I also ask about the general fund? Because we have a healthy one, doesn't that help us with bond rating or borrowing money?
It does. So we will, in the bond sale process, we will go through a financial rating discussion, and we will have to have that before the sale. And that fund balance and where it's at and how the district plans on using it in the future is some of the things that they will be looking at. It does affect the bond sales. Thanks.
I have a question.
Anything else? All right, Ms. Draws, we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. That'll bring us to item E. We will adjourn our workshop.
Perfect timing.